Chapter 27. Friday afternoon. I have no idea, Doreen said. The large pallet was still wrapped in clear plastic. She opened up one of the boxes and pulled out some sort of silver pipe. Nan said it was all car parts, so I don't know what that means. Mac looked at that piece she held and whistled. That's not exactly a car part, he said. That's a stovepipe for a Harley. Stovepipe? How does this hook onto a stove? She watched him as he turned it around in his hand and squatted in front of the box. Okay, so this could be worth some decent money. Seriously? He nodded. But you need somebody who knows what they're talking about. He opened a couple more boxes and then said, I have a buddy who collects and restores old cars and bikes. Let me talk to him. He pulled out his phone and walked out to the driveway. She busied herself opening the rest of the boxes, but to her, it was all unrecognizable. The pallet itself was a good 4 feet by 4 feet and at least another 4 feet high. She turned to find a couple spindles from something and another chair behind it that she dragged out to the junk pile in the grass. She looked around at a collection of brooms and just more junk and said, What do I do with the rest of this stuff? She moved something leaning up against the wall, and she realized it was a massive mirror. She cried out softly as she turned it around. Something about it made her think it didn't belong in the junk pile. She stared at it for a long moment, and then she took a picture of it and sent it to Scott. She moved it safely in the back of the garage with a blanket over it until everything was cleaned out but the pallet. Dusty, tired, but absolutely thrilled to have her garage back and to know the stuff outside was literally garbage, she turned around to find Mac once more buried in the pallet of boxes. What did your friend say? He's on his way, Mac mumbled as he pulled out more pieces. She stepped forward and said, Did you say he's coming right now? He looked up at her and nodded. He is coming right now. And his brother. One handles the bikes and the other restores cars, so with any luck, they'll be able to tell us what this is. That would be lovely. She shoved her hands in her pockets as she waited, and her fingers came into contact with the laminate stuff she had found at Penny's. She pulled out the pieces and held them in her hand, trying to put them together. She looked down and frowned. Pieced together, they looked like a nurse's badge. The metal clip was still attached to one of the pieces. She laid them down on the garage steps. It wasn't a complete badge, and it had been chewed up and blackened in places, but a name was here. Nancy Cousins. She took a picture of the pieces together. Mac walked over and asked, What have you got there? She pointed at the pieces. Apparently George used to burn garbage behind his house, and he always dumped it where the Echinacea plants originally were. Penny was trying to make the corner look better, but the plants weren't doing so well, and when I dug them up to transplant them, I found a bunch of these laminate pieces. The plastic is partially melted, and some of it's quite black, he said, but it looks like an ID tag for a hospital. She nodded. But I don't know how or why, she said. Mac frowned and said, I know that name. He stared off in the distance. I'll check on it. Don't you lose those. Do you want them? He thought about it and nodded. Put them in a bag for me, will ya? She could hear vehicles parking out front. She looked out into the driveway to see a couple very rough-looking guys. Mac grinned and said, That's the brothers. Are you sure you should have called them? She asked doubtfully. They're good guys, he said. Go put that stuff in a bag, please, and then come on out. I'll introduce you. He walked out and shook hands with both men. A lot of shoulder slapping was going on as he brought them over to the pallet, pulled out his pocket knife while she watched, and he cut off the rest of the plastic. She went inside and bagged up the laminate pieces Mac needed. When she came back out again with the bag in her pocket, she found the men exclaiming over the boxes. She stood off to the side and asked, Is anything there of value? The two brothers looked at her, one coming over with his hand outstretched and said, You must be Doreen. She grinned and shook his hand. What gave me away? How about that big bird on your shoulder? And this handsome fella? He bent to greet Muggs, who seemed delighted to see the man. She chuckled. I forget Thaddeus is there most of the time. He was on my shoulder not long ago, Mac said cheerfully, until he pecked me because I wasn't giving him enough attention. The men just laughed. She looked at the boxes on the pallet and asked them, Do you know what any of this stuff is? We certainly do, one of the brothers said. And if you're interested in selling the whole lot of it, we would be interested in buying it. She stared at them in surprise. Wow, okay. That's not what I expected. One nodded. They're all parts, original pieces from what we can tell, but a bit of a mismatch, like they're from a parts shop or something going under, where everything was sold off in lots. It does happen on a regular basis, he said, but in this case you've got some decent inventory here. The question then becomes, she said, what's it worth and what would you pay me for it? And of course you're wondering if those are two different things, right? She laughed. Well, I admit, I'm a little on the broke side, so if we can do a solid deal, that would be nice. We're prepared to give you a fair deal, the taller one said. What happens is, when we restore bikes, we're always looking for original parts, and sometimes we scour the countryside for them. All of these parts here don't belong on the same type vehicle. So we always need the right parts for each vehicle we work on. Ah, she said. She walked over, and they had all the boxes open and laid out in the garage. She shook her head. None of that looks special to me. Don't feel bad, one brother said. It doesn't look like a lot to most people. But we can probably do a few $1,000s, if you're interested. The other brother said, absolutely. That's about the right amount. Doreen looked to Mac, who shrugged before looking over at the brothers. What do you mean by a few $1,000s? He asked. The two brothers looked at each other and said, top dollar would be $3,000 and we'll take it right now off your hands. Mac raised an eyebrow. Don't suppose you can do a dump run as part of the deal, can you? Doreen asked craftily. Mac laughed. The men looked at her in surprise. She pointed to the pile of stuff in the grassy area and said, I have no way to get rid of all that busted up material. They took a look and said, we can take that too. We'll throw it in the back of our truck, put all this stuff inside the truck, and we're good to go. She beamed. So $3,000 and a dump run. It sounds good to me. They all shook hands. One of the brothers pulled out a roll of $100 bills and counted off Doreen's $3,000. When done, Mac threw an arm around her shoulder, hugged her, and whispered in her ear, tricky bit to add to the deal but nicely done. The brothers were already loading the individual boxes into their truck. They had one of those big cab things and it just seemed to absorb the boxes. She beamed up at Mac. Hey, once we can get rid of the garbage and the car parts, we can unload your truck and my car into my garage, and we can open the doors to the basement. Maybe move some of that up here. He groaned and rolled his eyes at that. I was happily forgetting the basement. She smiled. But if that's where the money is, he said, I can't forget about that. Well, before that, she said, let's get rid of all this and the outside stuff. He nodded. That's my marching order then, he said. How about you put on coffee? I'll give the guys a hand loading up everything, and maybe we can get them to give me a hand unloading those workbenches and the tool chests. I'm not looking forward to unloading that sucker. When she had the coffee on, she stepped out to see all the junk had been loaded. Her garage was empty, and the men were cheerfully helping Mac unload the toolboxes and the workbenches. They placed everything neatly, almost identical to the way it had been in George's garage, and then she popped the trunk on her car and started unloading the drawers. With the drawers in place, the men stood back and said, Wow, you got yourself a nice little workshop. She smiled and brought out the pegboards and said, Not yet, but once I get these hung, then maybe yes. I've got all the tools to hang, and I took pictures to see how it all should be set up. One brother grabbed a pegboard and said, "We can have these hung in no time. I've even got nails in the truck." Doreen said, "I've got a hammer. If you can do that, I'm about to pour coffee. I'll bring out a couple cups." And that was what she did. She poured coffee for everyone and brought them out with sugar and cream for the men. She'd chosen the best of the mugs, but they were still chipped. The men didn't seem to mind. It took only 15 minutes and all the pegboards were hung, with the workbenches below. She stared in amazement. And then she took the tools from the back seat of her car and hung them up. Using the pictures off her phone, all 3 men stayed long enough to get everything hung until her car was empty. She turned, looked at the guys, and smiled. "Thank you so much," she said. "I had absolutely no idea how I would get all that done." They shook their heads and one said, "That's a hell of a deal you got here today. Thousands of dollars worth of tools are here." "I know," she said. "Unfortunately, tens of thousands of dollars worth of renos have to be done on Nan's house, so I'll learn how to use some of these tools myself. Not to mention the gardening that has to be done here too. Whenever you get ready to hire people to do stuff you can't do, let us know," said one of the brothers. "We have a pretty good network of tradesmen." They tossed back their coffees, handed her their empty cups, shook Mac's hand again, and took off. Doreen stood there, holding the empty cups and staring at her garage. She looked back at Mac and said, "How the hell did we do that? We went from a garage full of junk to an absolutely fantastic workspace." He shook his head and said, "Only you. You're the only person I know who could possibly make this happen so fast. Now get into your car, turn it around, and park it inside your garage. It's a much safer way to come in and out every day." She grinned, hopped into her vehicle, and parked right in the middle of her newly repurposed garage. As she got out, she cried out, "Look. It fits." He nodded. "It does now." He walked to her car and placed the garage opener that she hadn't seen before on her visor. "Now you can get in and out using this. And to open the door from the inside, use the control on the wall beside the light switch." He pointed it out to her. She beamed and tried it out. "Perfect. Except, we have to get some of the furniture out from the basement. There's a lot to move, so we might want to get a start on it now. Especially as I don't have to go back to work today." She groaned, got in her vehicle, opened the garage door and backed it out, and parked it where it had been before. "I think I might need more coffee before we start that."